about pressure gauges now. So a pressure gauge is going to register the pressure above or below the atmospheric pressure. And we can say that the pressure, the absolute pressure, is equal to the atmospheric pressure plus the gauge pressure. Okay? We got all these different P's here. I'll write down what each one is. P is what we call the absolute pressure. PA is equal to the atmospheric pressure. And your PG is equal to the gauge pressure. So when you measure pressure on your tires, you put tire pressure gauge to it and get a reading in PSI or pounds per square inch. You're measuring the pressure difference between the absolute pressure and the atmospheric pressure. You're always subtracting that off with what you're reading. All of our equations, like the ones we're going to have over here and ones that we see later on, these are all absolute pressures. When you measure with a pressure gauge, you're only measuring the difference between the absolute and the atmospheric pressure. We write the equation out this way. You know, I keep saying that the pressure gauge is going to measure the difference between the absolute and the atmospheric pressure. If you rearrange that, you see this is P minus PA is equal to PG. And that's what I'm saying. We're only registering the pressure above or below the difference between the P and the PA. But I'd say memorize it this way because it's probably easier to memorize this way, where your absolute is PA plus PG. Sometimes people rearrange it the other way and they forget, you know, where the minus sign goes and the order there. Maybe here you can also remember where, you know, the ones with the subscripts go over here, the one without it goes over here. This is where I was saying with the PA, not to confuse this PA with the Pascal. So just make sure you're clear with your notation on those, that it's definitely a subscript and not a Pascal there for all these. With this equation here, it's a simple equation. It's just addition right there. It's not too hard to work with. There's nothing else to it. You just need to know when to use it. And realize that all of our equations are going to be absolute pressures. Without the A or the G, it's an absolute pressure. But it's very common for me to give you a problem and say, okay, you measure the tire pressure and you get a certain number. And anytime you're using a gauge to measure the pressure, you are getting the gauge pressure. If you're going to then go use that to find pressure at some depth, or maybe use it in the ideal gas law for pressures there, those are always going to be absolute pressures. So just be careful when you're reading the problems to make sure you're clear. It might not always call it the gauge pressure. It just might say, well, you hooked up a pressure gauge to something, and it might not always even use the word gauge. But if you're measuring it with a pressure gauge, that's giving you a gauge pressure. And you'll have to always convert that back to an absolute pressure to be able to use that with anything else. Okay? It's simple, easy math. The problem with this is that you just don't use it in every problem, so sometimes people forget it. Or just forget to be aware of it, because we can't put it in every problem, or I guess I could, but it just doesn't come up all the time, and it's not something you get a whole lot of practice with. You just need to remember that it exists. You will see it a couple times in the homework. We'll solve for the gauge pressure at the bottom of the tank or something today. I know you're going to have one in the next unit also where we're going to do some things where we're going to have the ideal gas law, we're going to have tires with pressure that's changing with temperature and things like that, and you'll be measuring things with the pressure gauge there. And so there'll be a few times where you have to be aware of that and have to convert. Once you know to use it, then it's simple to use. But sometimes that's an equation that people forget sometimes just because you don't use it a lot. Okay. We're going to go ahead and do an example with finding the pressure in a container of fluid and then using the gauge pressure. Then we'll spend the rest of the day talking about buoyancy. So let me give you moves here. We'll just do the first one now, we're gonna come back to the other two later on.